Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the updates to the Cyber Essentials scheme. So my name is Bruce Penson. I'm Managing Director of ProDrive. ProDrive are a Cyber Essentials certification body, so hence the reason for running this. And the webinar today is really pitched at anyone who's either got Cyber Essentials in their organization already, and has a renewal coming at some point over the next 12 months, or considering to put Cyber Essentials in place and to be applying to the scheme. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, the key objective is to cover the main changes to the scheme, which will go live this April. But we'll also have a recap on some of the other updates as well, and there's been some updates which were announced but actually get incorporated into the official marking scheme this April as well. We'll talk about what that means to you and your staff, and we'll do some Q&A afterwards as well. So can I ask, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So to kick things off, there's two levels for Cyber Essentials. Cyber Essentials Standard, which is a self-assessment. So you're answering questionnaires or working with a partner to answer some questions. There's also the Plus standard as well. So essentially, Plus is the same standard as Cyber Essentials. It's just that it's technically assessed. So someone will come in and run some tests on your system to check that the controls are in place that you said were in place when you did the self-assessment. And there is a period of 3 months after the standard assessment that you have to do the Plus assessment. But the actual standard is the same. So in theory, what you have to do to become compliant to either of those standards is the same. And I should also say that this standard is valid for 1 year. You must renew after a year. So let's talk about some of the changes. So the first major change is clarification on what devices, and by devices what I mean is PCs, Macs, whether it's laptops or desktops, mobile phones or tablets, and we're talking about devices that have business information on them or are used to access business information here. So if you have a member of staff, for example, who has a mobile phone and they're getting their company email on it, then that is considered to be business information, so that device will be in scope. Even if they use their company phone to access cloud services, that would still be in scope, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. So now Cyber Essentials provide this chart that you see on your screen to make it very, very clear what is and what isn't in scope. There was some ambiguity before over contractors and that kind of thing. It's very clear from this. So I think just a few points I'd like to make on this chart. Firstly, there's some organisations who will be impacted by this clarification. A good example is charities. So you can see that trustees, a device that is owned by the organisation, the charity, for instance, that the trustee is using is in scope. You probably have expected that before. However, if a trustee brings their own device to your organisation, to your offices, or using it remotely, and let's say, for example, they use that to access email for the charity, then that would also be considered to be in scope. Particularly, I think for charities, there's quite a bit of work to do here. If you're going to maintain Cyber Essentials standard across trustee devices, you might want to consider, rather than allowing them to use their own device, to provide a device for them to use. One other area of clarification I just want to make on this as well is around contractors. So you see a term third-party contractor down there. So as far as Cyber Essentials definitions are concerned, if you hire someone in your business, so they're working for you, but they're actually on a contract rather than on your payroll, that would fall under the employee scope. A third-party contractor is someone like, I don't know, for instance, a software provider. So let's say you're running Sage accounts on your system, and Sage dial in to do some work on Sage, then they will consider to be a third-party contractor. An MSP administrator, by the way, there's that's a sort of industry term, but that refers to external IT companies, just for some clarification there. So the implications on those is if external IT companies or third-party contractors are using their own devices, they're not within the scope. What Cyber Essentials also does say, although it's not an audit question, is that you should ensure that those parties that are doing work for you have security levels that match Cyber Essentials standards. So the easiest way to do that is to insist that they have Cyber Essentials and ask them for a copy of their certificate. You also see customer at the bottom there. So the implication of that is if you're running a portal, for instance, a customer portal, and a customer is accessing that portal, the device that the customer is using to access your portal does not have to be Cyber Essentials compliant. However, the device hosting your portal, which will probably be a server of some sort, would be. So I hope that clarifies that. If there are any questions, just pop them in the chat and I'll get around to those later. So just some further changes as far as devices go. And this is quite a major one, actually. So you no longer have to report the device model in your assessment. So previously, to clarify what that is, say I've got a Microsoft Surface 5 laptop that's running Windows 11. What I now need to report is I've got a laptop running Windows 11 and the version of Windows 11. I don't need to report that it's a Microsoft Surface 5. So why is that important? So in the past, if you had an out-of-date laptop, that was like a laptop that's no longer supported by the manufacturer, that would mean you would fail Cyber Essentials. Now you don't have to report that. So even if you are running an out-of-date device that's no longer supported by the manufacturer, as long as it's running an up-to-date operating system that is supported by the operating system vendor, then that's considered to be a pass. So for companies who are running old equipment but are running, say, the latest version of Windows on it, in the past they might have had quite a costly upgrade bill to upgrade that equipment. It's possible that they now may be able to pass Cyber Essentials with that same equipment, as long as it's running up-to-date version of Windows and the other software on it. There's also some clarification. If you use a mobile device, so I gave the example earlier of using a mobile device to receive email, which would be in scope. If you use a mobile device to simply use a multi-factor authentication app, so something like Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator on there, that authentication app isn't considered to be company data, and therefore that alone does not bring it into scope. Of course, the device is in scope if it's accessing any other business data, but if it's used just for multi-factor authentication, it's not within scope. And there's also some clarification on device unlocking. So Cyber Essentials has some requirements around how many times you need to enter, or after how many failed entries of a password a device will lock. For some devices, so examples are some Samsung smartphones, you can't actually control that. And so where the device lock is enforced by the manufacturer, that's excluded from the scope as well. So let's talk about just a few of the implications. I've already covered the potential for charities or any other organisations that have trustees or volunteers. But obviously, there's a potentially lower cost of entry to Cyber Essentials now, with the fact that some unsupported hardware might actually be acceptable. So it's quite important to note. There's also, I think, for most organisations before, where there was a grey area around what devices were in scope, what were out of scope, it's much clearer now, and therefore it's easy to assess before applying for Cyber Essentials what your likelihood is of passing it, rather than getting halfway through the process and finding out you've got some devices that actually fall within scope you've got no control over. But I think that the clear message is, even if you have people accessing your data from out of scope devices, you should be ensuring that those devices are safe. And the best way to ensure they're safe is to request that they're Cyber Essentials compliant. So the next set of changes relate to cloud services. Now, I should say that these changes were actually announced here at the last revision of Cyber Essentials, but because the implications are quite significant for organizations who have an awful lot of cloud services, and most businesses do now, Cyber Essentials had this as a question, but it wasn't a question that you could fail on. However, that is now, as of April, it is a question that you can get a non-compliance for and fail. So it's really important to understand what your responsibilities are for Cyber Essentials perspective around your cloud services. So essentially now, all cloud services have become within scope. Cloud services should have, and these, sorry, to just clarify, these should be cloud services that store company data. So something like your Microsoft 365, G Suite, if you're using something like Dropbox, HR systems, these will all be in scope. If you've got a cloud service that, I don't know, it'd be like an online store you use, doesn't have company data in it, therefore, that would fall out of scope. Also, if data is publicly available, and a good example of that is a website. So you might have a log on to the website, but the data is there for public view, that's out of scope as well. So hopefully that gives you a good guide as to which cloud services you would need to consider for this. So cloud service could be what we call infrastructure as a service. That's where you run servers and you have applications installed on them. It could be something called platform as a service. So the likes of Azure and AWS offer this. It's where an application is running there, but you don't actually have access to the service. That's the server, which is controlled by Amazon or Microsoft, or software as a service. And this is more like the likes of potentially something like Microsoft 365, where you log in, you just have a username and password, and you log into the app. So any service that's kind of accessed via a web browser is likely to be that sort of service. Now, the controls that need to be in place, whatever the type of service here, whatever element of it you control or your provider controls, still need to be in place. However, the responsibility, who actually implements and controls will change. So if it's software as a service, clearly you're not going to have any control over the firewall. That will be done by Microsoft, for example, in Microsoft 365. However, you still need to ensure, and it's your responsibility to ensure that that firewall is still in place. So you'd get that by going to Microsoft, looking at their terms and conditions, or most software as a service providers have a security pack that tells you all the controls that are in place. So what Cyber Essentials would want you to do in that case is to review those terms and make sure they meet the requirements of Cyber Essentials. Or, of course, if your provider has a Cyber Essentials certificate, you don't need to worry about that. It just makes it a lot easier. So moving on, now the principles of Cyber Essentials user account control will apply to cloud services now. So what that means is, firstly, if multi-factor authentication is available, it must be switched on for any accounts you have. So that's user accounts or admin accounts or any other accounts. So it's really, really important. If it's not available, so if your cloud provider does not offer multi-factor authentication, Cyber Essentials will want you to report it. It's considered a minor non-compliance. Obviously, it's kind of outside of your control other than changing application provider. But what Cyber Essentials will be doing is, when they see those providers reported, they'll be chasing them and saying, listen, guys, anyone who's got Cyber Essentials in the future won't be able to use your service if you don't give a multi-factor authentication as an option. I should just also add that some cloud providers, they don't offer multi-factor authentication outright, but they offer something called single sign-on, which means you can, for instance, log in with Microsoft 365 login. If you have that single sign-on to log in instead of a normal username and password, and on that single sign-on you have multi-factor authentication, which on the Microsoft you absolutely 100% should, then that's considered to be acceptable. Sometimes it should be said that to get single sign-on, you might need to go to a higher plan, i.e. pay your cloud provider more money to get that. Other account controls that Cyber Essentials says should apply to all systems also apply to cloud. So your day-to-day work should not be done with an admin account. It should be done with a restricted user account, and you should have separate admin accounts for managing account services which are not used on a day-to-day basis. Now, this can be a problem with some cloud providers because they charge you on a per user basis. And if you create a separate admin account, you might get charged an additional per user fee for that. So it's just something to look out for. However, it's something that Cyber Essentials are coming down on, and they'll expect to see that, what they call account separation there. So if you're unsure about how to do that, probably the best approach is to speak to your cloud provider and ask them for some assistance on it. So in terms of like implications for your team on this, obviously there's a couple of things that people might find it restrictive, not having any administrative account permissions on their day-to-day account. It's something they're just going to have to get used to, I'm afraid, and there's not really any kind of mitigation of that, but it is a really important control anyway. The other side of it, potentially, obviously, you could end up, if you've got 20 different cloud systems, you could end up with 20 different multi-factor authentication codes to enter at the beginning of the day. So there's obviously a productivity impact to that. The best way to mitigate that is to use single sign-on. So for instance, you might have your 10 cloud systems, but you can log on to all of them with your Microsoft account that is secured with multi-factor authentication. So you in theory only need to do that multi-factor authentication process once rather than 10 times. So then the major updates, there's a few others just to consider here. There's some changes in scope around anti-malware. I don't think it will affect the majority of businesses. There used to be something called sandboxing, where if you isolated an operating system, that was an acceptable means of malware control. It was a very grey area, so that's been removed. So essentially now, anti-malware controls, you either have anti-malware, which you can do on Mac and PC operating systems, or on mobile phones and tablets, which don't have anti-malware available. You have to restrict the applications that are installed to an approved list of signed applications. Signed means it comes from the App Store, genuine App Store, so the Apple or the Google Store, and applications that your organization has deemed are acceptable to install on that device. There are a couple of changes to Cyber Essentials Plus, but essentially they are around the testing of the anti-malware, because now the scope has changed. Previously, anti-malware had to have signature-based protection. This is the kind of old style of anti-malware where it looks at a list of common viruses and looks on your device and see if there's a match. That's not really appropriate in the current world, and most anti-malware now is what we call next generation anti-malware, so the testing has to be different. It probably doesn't really impact most businesses, because as long as you've got a up-to-date anti-malware subscription, you're mostly likely to have the new type of anti-malware. Then the other thing I was just to mention before, that a device that's out of date may now still pass Cyber Essentials, but there is a potential catch in that. So if you have an out-of-date piece of hardware, it's running the latest version of Windows, but you might, for example, because the hardware's out of date, have a very old driver, which is the Windows software that runs, that sort of connects Windows to the hardware running underneath. If that driver is out of date and it's deemed to have software vulnerabilities in, that will get picked up by Cyber Essentials Plus, and you may actually fail. So there's a bit of a risk in out-of-date hardware, in that it could be picked up with a Cyber Essentials test, which is something called a vulnerability scan. So if you really want to be certain that you haven't got a problem and you are declaring your Cyber Essentials correctly, you probably want to make sure that you're running a vulnerability scan yourself before going for Cyber Essentials Plus. So final few points. You can't pick and choose elements of each assessment. Cyber Essentials is based on versions. So if you're on the previous version and you've just done the audit, that's fine. If you're in progress of an audit, you've got a period of time to complete that audit. I think it's about 6 months. Once you move on to the new version, which we've talked about today, that's the standard you're assessing on. If you're currently on the old version, you've got to renew it next year. It'll be on the new standard. There's also another standard that runs alongside Cyber Essentials, which was previously called IASME Governance. It's now changed to IASME Assurance, and there's been updates to that standard as well. To clarify what that standard is, Cyber Essentials is about the technical controls on your systems. IASME Governance, or IASME Cyber Assurance as it's now called, is about the policies and procedures to manage your data and to give your people working in your organization, your staff, guidance on how to behave and how to operate those systems. So that's also a really important standard. it runs alongside Cyber Essentials. It's a good standard to take at the same time. If you'd like more information on that, then please let us know. We might even run a webinar on it if there's enough demand. And the final point, expect the assessment process to take longer because you've got to audit all your cloud systems as well now. And the more cloud systems you've got, the longer it's likely to take. So just make sure that when you're renewing that you allow enough time to do that. Otherwise, you might end up either missing your renewal date or finding that your time is completely taken up by doing this. A few resources. By the way, these slides will be sent around to everyone that's attended today, so don't feel that you need to write this down. There's a blog by IASME who run the Cyber Essentials scheme that just gives a bit more of an in-depth summary of the things we talked about today. You can also get a list of the IT infrastructure requirements for Cyber Essentials. So this is basically the standard that you get audited to. And you can actually see the Cyber Essentials questions without actually applying for the standard. There's a link to the latest question set there as well. So we've got one question here. Is Cyber Essentials still worth the trouble? And is it the best way to protect against cybercrime? So is it still worth the trouble? I think the fact that it's become more difficult to get Cyber Essentials, or more work, sorry, I should probably say, to get Cyber Essentials, is a good thing because it means the standard has been raised. So I would say it's even more worth it doing it now than it was before. If you get a Cyber Essentials certificate now, you've put more mitigations in place than you would have done if you got one 2 years ago. So absolutely 100% it is worth doing. And is it the best way to protect against cybercrime? There's lots of things you can do to protect against cybercrime. I wouldn't say any of them are the best way or the worst way of doing things. What I would say is Cyber Essentials is a standard that's been introduced by the government. The idea is that it's an entry point that every small business or small medium business should be able to achieve without a huge amount of additional cost. And it will mitigate against a lot of the common cyber threats that are out there. So what happens is with cyber criminals, as with any criminal, they tend to go after the weaker links. If you've got Cyber Essentials controls in place, you won't be one of those weaker links, and therefore you're going to be less of a target than you would be right now. Nothing is going to stop you getting a cyber attack, and you should still absolutely 100% prepare for a cyber attack as if you are going to suffer one at some point in time. And I wouldn't say that Cyber Essentials will stop it, it just make it less likely that that happens. So we've got another question. Does Cyber Essentials still require software patches to be applied within 14 days? And what third-party enterprise software providers, what if third-party enterprise software providers only make patches available infrequently? So to answer that question, yes, it does still require that you apply software patches to your systems within 14 days of release. So there is a bit of flexibility around that in reality, but that is what Cyber Essentials expects you to do. Now, there are some dangers in that, of course, and anyone who's managed patching on Microsoft operating systems will know what happens when a buggy patch gets released, which it does from time to time. But Cyber Essentials sees that as the lesser of two evils. So yes, that is still a requirement. If third-party enterprise software providers only make patches available infrequently, that is not necessarily a problem because the standard says they've got to be applied within 14 days of release. So if they're only releasing one patch a year, that doesn't really matter. Now, the other requirement is that Cyber Essentials says that your software must be supported. Again, if supported means that the software provider is only releasing the patches once every year, that's fine. What you would expect is that the software provider is patching any vulnerabilities as and when they come up. And if you do have vulnerabilities in your system, you may fail the Cyber Essentials Plus scan, which looks for known vulnerabilities. However, if it's a supported piece of software, strictly within the laws of the standard, and there is no update to apply, then you should pass that. The IASME Cyber Assurance does require that you run a vulnerability assessment twice a year now, and that you act appropriately on that vulnerability assessment. So That doesn't say, again, that if there's a vulnerability in your software, you'll fail. It wants to see that you've got a process for acting appropriately with it. So your appropriate action might be, if you're running a piece of enterprise software, it's got a vulnerability, your software provider has not released a patch, but that vulnerability is known about and has been around for a while. Your appropriate way of acting will probably be to approach them to understand what they're doing about it, and monitoring the situation. Or maybe if they say, well, we're quite happy that there's a vulnerability in there, we don't really care about that, you'd probably want to change software providers. So I hope that answers the question there. So we're going to wrap up now. Thanks for attending. These slides will be sent around after the webinar. If you have any further questions, then obviously do contact us and let us know, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you very much.